So welcome to today's Interspecies Conversations lecture. I'm Kate Armstrong. I'm the Executive Director of Interspecies Internet, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the trustees and the organisation. Interspecies Conversations series is a regular online talk series that gives the opportunity to invite leading professors, scientists, researchers and students to share and present work that contributes to advancing the acceleration and understanding of the diversity, forms and functions of communication in other species. The series showcases emerging ideas and discoveries and hosts open discussions where we, the community, can join in the conversation with ideas and feedback. Today, our presentation is from Catherine Hobaiter. It is entitled Ape Talk, Reimagining the Study of Great Ape Communication. So Kat is a field primatologist who has spent the past 20 years living with and studying wild primates across Africa. She is a reader in Origins of Mind at the University of St Andrews and principal investigator of the Wild Minds Lab. She leads ape field sites in Uganda and Guinea and serves on expert groups for the UN and the IUCN. Catherine will describe how her team is reimagining the study of non-human communication to foster a deeper understanding of other species and the evolutionary origins of our own. Kat, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And yeah, welcome to not Africa, but beautiful sunny Scotland, everybody. It was too gorgeous a day for me to try and do this talk inside. And so I'm looking forward to seeing what you all think and getting some feedback on our work. Let me just start to share my slides and then we can get going. There we go, share screen. Hopefully, yeah, okay, good. That should now work. Okay, so as you were just hearing, my research group is the Wild Minds Lab at the University of St Andrews. We work on communication and cognition in non-humans in the wild and a pretty wide range of topics and species. But what we're probably best known for is our work on wild ape gestural communication. And that's the repertoire of different gestures that apes use, how they combine them, what they mean. You'll notice as I talk that I'm a very gestury person. As apes, we communicate in many different ways, and gesture is a fundamental part of that. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is really centered in the gesture data. But I think what we're thinking about is relevant to lots of different modalities and lots of different species. And so I'm taking ape gesture as a good example of the ideas that we want to bring to the ape communication conversation, but it's not necessarily something that would be limited to ape gesture in many cases. I split my time between St Andrews and the field, and honestly, a lot of the questions that really interest me are about the apes themselves. I want to know what shapes their behavior, their lives. I want to know what it means to be a chimpanzee. It's not always all about us, right? But we can use those data to ask questions also about the evolutionary origins of our own behavior and questions, for example, like how language might have evolved. So my goal here is to give you a really quick flavor of lots of different things that we're doing. I'm going to kind of sort of butterfly my way across lots of different topics, and hopefully what that will do is stimulate opportunities for discussion, and we can go down the rabbit hole on any one of them that you find interesting afterwards. One thing just to highlight is the work that I do is always been part of a large team of people. Everything that I'm sharing with you today is made possible by people from right around the world. And so, yeah, it's really been something where I think the diversity of people coming at this question has led us to think really diversely about it. And I see that as, yeah, a definite plus to be involved with such an incredible team. And I think, you know, that highlights this just basic core principle that we bring to this work, which is that if we're thinking about understanding another species communication, another chimpanzees, or gorillas, or bonobos, and elephants, our default so far, typically in my field, has often been to say, what does language look like? Now, can they do that too? Do they have syntax? Do they have meaning? But I think it has to always pay to remember that there are lots of things that they're doing that we're not. And if we take that language human-centric perspective, we're going to systematically underestimate the richness and diversity that we see in different ways to communicate across species. And so, you know, like we would be terrible at communicating underwater as a cetacean, right? We would be terrible at communicating across dozens of kilometers the way an elephant could through ultrasonic vibrations that we might not even be aware of. So our perspective on animal communication is just naturally impoverished if we take that anthropocentric perspective. And yet, at the same time, it's a really useful one, right? Because we are humans, scientists studying this. Language is our default system. It's one that's essential not just to how we communicate, but how we think. And so if we're interested in decoding communication between two different species, potentially humans and another species, it's really helpful for us to have at least half of that equation, R half, for example, worked out. And to at least start to use linguistic frameworks to see what we have in common, as long as we remember that's never going to be the be-all and end-all of what another species is doing. And human language is itself a really interesting starting point because it is such a powerful tool to communicate. It might be the most powerful communication system that any species has evolved so far. And that's because with language, with a relatively simple set of sounds or movements, I can articulate any idea that comes into my mind. Novel ones, completely made up ones. I can share those ideas with the minds of other people around me to greater or lesser success, depending on how my communication is going. And I can use language for incredible, beautiful things, for poetry, to describe the equations that started the universe, to put somebody on the moon, to do really incredible things. I can also use language in the way that, honestly, we use it most of the time, which is to gossip about our neighbors, talk to our friends, put really silly things on the internet, tell jokes. The richness that we use language for can extend all the way up to those really human characteristic, Shakespearean kind of plays and poems. But it's worth remembering that the majority of what we use language for is basically the sort of social kind of lubricant that gets us through our day-to-day lives, essentially. So if we're interested in translating other species communication, I think it really helps to think about what we as a species need to communicate, what we're using that communication for day-to-day, as well as in those unusual examples, and then to always ask the same question of another species. What is it that they need to communicate to each other? And what's the most effective way for them to do so? Because it's going to remind us sometimes to look in some unusual places that might not always be human relevant. Now, one thing just to highlight, because I often get asked these kind of questions when I'm talking about ape communication, elephant communication, and things that we've found and that we're excited about. And systematically, I'll get questions like, my dog can do that too. And in many cases, that might well be true. But I think one thing that we tend to underestimate in our interpretation of other species communication is how similar it is to us, because it's superficially similar. So a lot of other species, when they are communicating, and they're doing that very effectively with rich, nuanced information, they are still basically broadcasting that information to the world around them. Think of it a little bit like a radio. You are throwing out information. You're not necessarily paying a great deal of attention to who your audience is. You might yell a little louder or a little longer, depending on audiences. But we make those kind of broadcast signals too, and it's a helpful comparison, because if I pick up a pan that's too hot in the kitchen, if I touch the stove, I would yell, I'd blow on my fingers. If you're sat in the kitchen with me, you're going to understand from the signals and the communication I'm broadcasting that the stove is hot and that it might be dangerous, you shouldn't go near it, that I've hurt myself in some way. You're getting a lot of information about that. But that's not why I produced those signals. I would have made them even if there was no one else in the kitchen, right? Now, what I get to do with language is I get to tell somebody who comes into the kitchen 20 minutes later, when my hand is no longer being triggered by that heat stimulus, I'm not feeling that pain, I get to tell them to watch out, the stove is hot, if I see them go near it. Now, I think this highlights two really important things. One is that our characteristic use of language is about thinking very specifically about the recipient that we are communicating to. who they are, what they know, what they don't know. Because I could choose to tell them, but I'm not going to tell you with language because I know you already know because you were there at the time. So we have this very characteristic use of our communication that we would call intentional communication. And it's also something that didn't replace that broadcast system of communication that we see widespread in the world around us. We use those signals too. We just interlayer language within that system. Now, it really revolutionized our understanding of non-human communication, of other species communication, when we started to find out that great ape gestures are used in that one-to-one intentional manner as well. This gestural system is incredibly rich. They have well over 100 different kinds of gesture, and they are using them every single day, all of the time, to communicate information between specific individuals to a partner with a goal in mind. We've found evidence now for some other species doing similar kinds of intentional communication. This is not only an ape gesture thing, but what is unique about ape gesture so far is that we have a whole system being used this way. Typically, when we found intentional signals in other species, it's one or two very specific signals in one or two very specific contexts. That's always going to be hard for us to try and compare to language. Whereas with great ape gesture, we have 100 signals being used all the time, every day, by everybody from a young infant to a 65-year-old grandpa in the forest. Now, what does ape gesture look like for anybody that hasn't kind of gotten to hang out with apes? Then here what we've got is a little video, and this is Zephyr gesturing to Rahara. So I'm hoping this is going to play okay. Let me just come over here so I can see. Yes, there we go. Okay. So what you're seeing here is Zephyr is shaking the branch and giving a big loud scratch, right? And we're going to see that this is not a broadcast signal. So he's waiting for a response. Rahara takes her time, she's an older lady, and he repeats it, shakes, scratches, and adds an arm raise. He elaborates in that kind of second iteration of the communication. And eventually she comes down, he's waiting for her response, and then they're going to start agreeing. Now, if I make an analogy with my use of language, what we're seeing in this behavioral interaction is an indication of how he is thinking when he's communicating. So for example, if you imagine that I'm asking you to pass me the coffee at breakfast time, now, despite the fact that my need for coffee at breakfast is going to be a continuous stimulus, I'm not just going to broadcast coffee, 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 coffee at you, right? This is not a stimulus-driven interaction most of the time. But what I would do is say, please, could you pass me the coffee? And I'd wait for a response because I recognize that you are an individual I'm communicating with. If you then don't pass me the coffee or you pass me the decaf or something else, I'm going to repeat myself. I might elaborate if I need to illustrate that more clearly, the coffee, please, with a point or something. And then the one thing that is guaranteed to stop me asking for the coffee is when you pass me the coffee. So this kind of back and forth interaction, attending to your recipient, using the right kind of signal depending on their attentional state, waiting for a response, persisting and perhaps elaborating when you fail, those are behavioral markers that we can use, and we actually borrowed from the study of language development in early infants to look at the communication of another species and to identify that kind of characteristically linguistic intentional use. And I can actually use that same thing to decode what the signal means, because as I mentioned there at the end, the one thing that stops me from asking you for the coffee is when you pass me the coffee. And that's a really good clue as to what I wanted in the first place. Now, we've come at signal meanings in lots of different ways over the years in other species communication. We could look at context. Now, the thing is, I'm going to ask you to pass me the coffee over breakfast, in the afternoon, after dinner, in different places, in different times. You know, we might be eating, we might not be eating, we might be on the road, driving somewhere. If I just take context, you're never going to really get at the meaning of what pass me the coffee is intended to say. If I look at, for example, when I give the signal, pass me the coffee, what you do next, then that's going to include all of those mistakes where you passed me the decaf or ignored me or just told me to get up and get it myself. What I need is the behavioral response that you produce that stops me from signaling. Because in that case, not in every single time, but most of the time, the thing that you do that stops me asking is going to be the thing that I was asking for. It's going to give me a sense of, it's going to give us a sense of the meaning. And it's a way for us to access what is essentially a fundamentally cognitive state by looking at the behavioral interaction as observers of another species. Now, we've done that for a long time. We've been building on work that started in the 1980s and that we in St. Andrews really took into the wild and started studying systematically wild chimpanzees and bonobos, gorillas, orangutans. And we have used fundamentally similar methods to address those kind of questions. What are the repertoires? What are the gestures? What do they mean? But I think we have some new approaches available to us, and we're starting to be able to develop and push the field in some interesting new directions. So like I said, I'm going to give us a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully that'll give you an idea of where we're going with the field of ape gesture as well as where we've been. Now, the fundamental feature at the heart of language and ape gesture, that intentional back and forth kind of interaction between partners, means that it seemed like gesture was going to be a great way to answer questions about the evolution of language. There are, like I said, hundreds of different gestural signals being used. They're being combined with each other. We can decode what they mean, not just what context they're in or what reaction they get, but really what the signal are intended to convey with their communication. But and yet, the more that I work on this and the more that I looked into this, it was this frustration of every time we had something where we said, we need to show this, we could check that box, but it wasn't getting us to an answer to the kind of question of why humans have language. And I think that's fundamentally about the fact that if we're just looking at the tools in a species communication toolkit, what are the signals, how are they combined, what are they used for? The simple answer is going to be that many species, certainly all of the great apes, but also cetaceans, elephants, probably a much wider range of species if we looked at it, are going to have many of the same tools in their communication toolkits we do. And I think if we want to know why we have language, what might be specific about language, what might be characteristically human about our use of communication, we have to be thinking about what we and other species are using that communication for day to day. Because there's been a really long list of human traits that have been proposed as the reason that we have to have language, right? We've put forward all of these things that said, right, humans have language because we needed it to do. But the problem is that decades of research with other species has also shown that if you are talking about chimpanzees, corvids, cetaceans, language is not needed to learn from each other. It is not needed to organize where and when to forage different foods, to pass on essential cultural knowledge, including things about tools and songs and different things to eat, to coordinate hunting, to have richly structured social politics. All of that is present in other species. And even the production of things like stone tools that are so important in our hominin history, you can learn that through simple gesture-based instruction. You do not need language to acquire it. So if other intelligent systems are capable of all of this without language, and we check more and more of those behavior off the list, it really starts to look like language isn't emerging for this kind of practical day-to-day communication that we've necessarily been looking at with that just basic tools in the toolkit kind of structure. What are you doing? What do you mean? And there's a quote by Sydney Brenner that I often use, probably far too often, but I just think it just hits the nail on the head for me, which is Sydney Brenner said, the difference between the telephone directory and a Shakespeare play is that while both have a grand cast of characters, only the play has a plot. Now, Brenner was talking here about DNA and why knowing the structure of DNA in really rich detail is not going to get us all the way to describing human behavior. But this is the same analogy I'm trying to make with other species communication right now. Understanding why humans have language is less about the linguistic toolkit we have. It is not the grand cast of characters. It is going to be all about the plot. It is about the way our identities, our relationships, and our social world shapes the communication that we use. And if we're going to get to grips with how that system evolved and whether it is uniquely as well as characteristically human, we're going to have to get stuck into a very different way of looking at communication in other species. So forgive me, we're going to get a little nerdy for a second and go into some Gracian linguistics. I promise I'll make it as painless as I can. But one absolutely characteristic aspect of language use is that there is a difference between what we would call the sort of timeless meaning of a word or gesture and its occasion meaning. So the timeless meaning of a word is what it means in general. It's sort of average meaning across its uses. The occasion meaning is the meaning of a word or gesture in a particular set of circumstances. And that flexibility for exactly the same word with the same intonation between two individuals to mean something entirely different depending on social context is a very distinctive feature of human linguistic communication. So to illustrate the distinction, imagine that you are driving down a dark country road and a car comes the other way and flashes their lights at you, right? So we can assume that they're trying to tell us something, but what are they trying to tell us, right? If we want to decode this message, there is no direct correlation with something in the environment where flashing your lights always means the same thing. You have to think about what the other driver intends you to understand on this occasion. So as well as there is a kind of timeless meaning of a sort of, hey, pay attention, but you have to be able to interpret what the driver wants you to understand in this particular instance to respond appropriately. Because it could be a friend that recognizes you. It could be them indicating there is a problem with your car. It could be them telling you there's a problem up ahead and you need to slow down. And your reaction has to be different in each of those cases, right? Now we can work this out because we're good at decoding this kind of communication, right? So a quick check of their car, you don't recognize it, it's not a friend. Quick check of your car, it's hopefully not on fire and therefore there's no problem with it. So in this case, the occasion meaning suggests that there's probably danger ahead and you should slow down. So we're co-constructing a specific meaning together in the moment, even though the signal has remained the same. And we do that all the time with language. So we're constructing meaning depending on social context. And if I say the words something like we just meet, and I say nice shirt. Now, if I've just said hello to you and then I look at you and say, oh, nice shirt, that's going to be a great compliment, right? Hopefully. But I could use exactly the same sounds, same words, same intonation to mean something very different. Because if you've just asked me if I like your shoes and I say nice shirt, then that's going to mean something very different on that occasion. The same signal has been used to construct a different meaning based on our social circumstances. Now, here's the rub, because what we have done so far on the structure of communication systems in other species has been a really good way to get at those semantic or timeless meanings. So what's the average meaning we see the signal being used for across individuals, across situations, across occasions? But we know other species have that kind of meaning in their communication, and it is unlikely then to get us to the characteristic use of meaning in language, which is occasion meaning. But I do think we've got promising areas we can start to look at in great apes and also in other species as we're accumulating bigger data sets to tackle these questions. Because when we think about how human language has been explored, it has all been about social differences, individual differences. We recognize that there are over 7,000 spoken, 200 signed languages in the world. We get into things like accents, dialects, idiom. There are rich linguistic cultures that we have been exploring for decades, centuries at this point. But when we've looked at other species, what we have done is say, what does a chimpanzee gesture mean? What does a vervet monkey's alarm call mean? What does an elephant greeting look like? Variation between individuals, between groups, is seen as a problem that we need to get rid of in our data, right? We're constantly trying to get rid of outliers or work out what the average kind of use is. We're deliberately trying to control for it at every level. But I think if we want to understand what that communication system is used for, and if there is that characteristically human use of meaning in other species communication, we have to get to grips with describing variation in its use and how it's expressed day by day, instance by instance on each occasion. So here in the Wild Minds Lab, we are tackling that question in a few different ways. Number one is to try to build the kind of data sets that let us answer those questions in the first place. And that means big data sets. So we've been looking across species, groups, landscapes, and generations, between individuals, within individuals. We have around 25,000 gesture tokens in our database now. We made a few new friends along the way. So we've been looking at some elephant communication. We introduced or reintroduced the ape I think of as the true forgotten ape in this area, which is humans. We often don't look at us using the same tools that we use to look at other species. And one of the first important steps we needed to take in this process was to pass our descriptions of gesture use into much greater detail, and then to also try to get rid of some of the anthropocentric bias at the heart of them. Because we, and that is all of my own work for the last few decades, have tended to define gestural repertoires, signal repertoires, like most behavior ethograms, top down, right? We decide in advance as a good scientist, we set out our methodology, we create our ethogram, and then we come up with careful descriptions and go to the field or to wherever we're collecting data and mark if they're present and how they're used. but it is not at all clear from the perspective of the apes or any species using them that those predefined units of gesture make sense to them. So if I raise one arm as a chimp, is that the same as me raising two arms? Does it matter if I kind of flex my wrist? Does it matter how, if I hold a fist up? Like, what we need to do is build our gestures from the bottom up. And so what we've been doing is coding in very fine-grained detail. The action stroke, the movement, the body part, repetition, if an object is used, all of that separately. And then we can use the data sets of real-world gesturing by the apes and apply things like cluster analyses, latent class analyses to extract what we're looking for is a consistent pattern of use. And we can do that at different levels of detail. So what we're then able to do is to describe broad units, raise, independently of what other modifier is incorporated, or very nuanced units, raise your arm, your right arm with your wrist flexed and your fingers kind of relaxed. Now we can build those units at different scales. So what's really powerful about this is we can come at questions in different ways without having to recode our data, which, as any communication scientist will tell you, is a very painful thing to have to do. We can also be relatively sure that those units are units that are likely relevant to the species using them, because they are genuine patterns of co-occurrence that create a distinct, discrete unit in their own communication and repertoire. Now, once we've done that, we can start to re-tackle questions using a repertoire of units defined by boundaries salient to the species to re-ask in some ways questions about things like combinations and use and meanings. We can look at the kind of things that might shape use. So for example, how does life in the savannah rather than the forest shape your gesturing? What about the different challenges you face in day-to-day life? If you are using hierarchically structured sequences of behavior in your tool use or your food processing, are you able to adapt that to incorporate similar hierarchical structure into your communication? What about your social world? How do features like group cohesion, kinship, hierarchy, your sex, your age, your social position and experience shape the gestures that you produce? Now, we also have to think about what might vary. So we talked about the signal units being described at different details, but things like what about the speed and timing of interactions and communications? Is there the equivalent of a sort of fast talking city kind of like group of apes, or a slow country drawl kind of like accent? Or, is that a species difference? It is a population difference. We need to describe that at great detail in order to be able to look for those potential differences. So let's do a quick whirlwind tour, as I said, of the kind of things that we've been finding as we start to poke at these questions from a new perspective. So variation in species, right? Sometimes it is going to be really obvious why we get it. And here, for example, the physical environment is an obvious shaper of the differences that we see between orangutan and chimpanzee gesturing. When they're making the same gesture action, orangutans are much more flexible in their choice of limb than a chimpanzee. Because orangutans are arboreal. It may well be the case that their arms are being, occupied with locomotion or just stability, and that they're going to reach their leg instead of their arm. Whereas as a more terrestrial chimpanzee, you have a free choice of limb and you tend to use your arms. So sometimes there are obvious shapers of difference. Sometimes, though, the factors shaping species level variation seem more opaque. And if we look at the time, for example, to respond to a gesture, we see species differences that don't seem to be linked to environment or biology. So chimpanzees and bonobos are the closest genetically. They have the most similar habitat, but they're very different in their latency to respond. Now, initially, what we suspected might be going on here is that it might have something to do with the social structure of your group. So bonobos and orangutans are very cohesive, and they spend much more time interacting with each other than chimpanzees do. So we thought, okay, if you're cohesive, you spend more time interacting, you can respond more quickly, right? So, it's sort of like if you know somebody very well, you can kind of reply almost before they finish their sentence. But then we added gorilla data into the mix, and we ended up with something that completely threw that out of the window, because gorillas are highly cohesive and interact in small groups all the time, but they are very slow to respond. So it seems to be more complicated than that, and we've got more work to do. It might be that there's a sort of interaction perhaps between social cohesion and things like the steepness of your social hierarchy, which looks very different in a gorilla than a bonobo. What else have we been taking a look at? So some of the ways in which variation is expressed, we can see in things like chimpanzee drumming. So chimpanzees drum on the big buttress roots of trees, and we've been able to show that an individual drumming will do so with a signature rhythmic style. Now, that didn't come as too much of a surprise, because honestly, any of us that have spent time with individual chimps for a while, especially where they've been drumming a lot, we know who's drumming when they drum, right? If I hear a drum in the forest, I'm like, oh, that's Howard, that's Salu, that's Frank. So we knew we could do it. Now, if we can do it, I'm sure the chimps could do it, but we needed to try to work out how we were detecting that, right? And one of the things that became really interesting as we poked at this is that those signature styles are not fixed. So we find the signature styles in traveling drums, but not in display drums, suggesting that the chimps are able to choose to encode identity into their drumming when they want to, and perhaps sometimes to disguise it when they don't. So it might be the case, that if you are drumming for traveling, you're often sort of trying to find other individuals. You want to communicate identity across distance. But if you're drumming in a display, you might not want to reveal who it is that's displaying, especially if you're not the highest ranking guy. When maybe the alpha male is around the corner, you don't want him to know that you were displaying in his absence, maybe. So there's lots of reasons why that might be, but it's really nice to see that they've got the individual flexibility moment to moment to choose to do that. We're also seeing some really interesting drumming variation when we look at population levels. And honestly, this is super hot off the press. We literally have just been running these analyses a few weeks ago. And we see, for example, that West African chimps are extremely isochronous and drum with more beats than East African chimps. So West African chimps are sort of a very regular 4/4 kind of rock drummer kind of population. And East African chimps are your kind of, jazz, everybody's got a little more creative space to kind of go their own way kind of drumming populations. Now, why would that be? It doesn't seem to be environmental, because West African chimps, if you live in a savanna with itty bitty buttresses, or you live in a primary rainforest with just the most beautiful apex rainforest trees, you're still drumming more similarly to each other than you are to an East African chimp. So there's lots, everywhere we look for variation in the expression of signals and information, we're finding lots of evidence for it. Now, one thing that I was really interested in is if you're finding variation between groups, between individuals, what happens in the case of individuals who are moving groups, right? So, if you are born in Newcastle and you move up to Scotland, or, are you going to stay with your Geordie accent for all of your life, or do you get to pick up a little bit of the local dialect? Do you get to shift accent? Does it matter when? And it's relatively unusual that we can get these data, because in the wild, usually when a female migrates out of a group, then she's gone to another group and we just don't know where. But very occasionally, we've been lucky enough to be able to have females who've migrated between two groups that we're working with, and to be able to see them both before and after. So these two female chimpanzees are Nora and Bahati. They grew up in the Sonso community in the beautiful Budongo rainforest in Uganda, in East Africa. I've known them both since they were very young kids, and about 10 years ago, like most female chimps, they migrated. And luckily for us, they migrated to the neighboring community, Waibira, that we just started to work with. So we're going to come back to them in a second, but a little bit of background information. So one really common chimpanzee gesture is a leaf clip. It is the chimpanzee version of flirting. It's a sort of chimp pickup line, I guess. And it turns out that while widespread across chimpanzee communities, all chimpanzee communities that have been studied leaf clip, there is some really interesting variation in the details of how it's expressed. So sometimes the leaf is torn through the middle, which makes a really loud sound. Sometimes it's pulled off at the stalk. Sometimes it's kind of plucked off entirely, a sort of, like with a daisy, she loves me not kind of style. And there might be variation, so that one's quite silent. If you wanted to be sneaky about your flirting, you might want to use that version of it rather than the loud, obvious leaf clip tear one. And what we did first was look at the two chimpanzee communities. Now, they are neighbors in the same forest. They are experiencing the same sort of plants, trees, environments. They share the same gene pool. We've got migrations between them. And we see striking differences between the two communities and how this gesture is expressed. So Waibira are much more variable, but prefer generally to use leaf pulls, and Sonso are just die-hard leaf clip kind of users. So first of all, we've got stable evidence for, we've got clear evidence for a stable group difference in the way that a gesture is expressed. So possibly the first evidence for something that we might say is akin to a dialect. It's the same gesture, it means the same thing, but there's a difference in its expression. But if we've got a dialect, what happens when chimps move between groups? Well, if you remember Nora and Bahati, those two eligible young females who moved over to the group, they were born into that leaf clipping community Sonso. We have the data from those days showing that they knew and responded appropriately to leaf clips. But when they moved to Waibira, they did not miss a beat. So they are now responding and using leaf pull gestures. And it's sort of, what we would say is it's kind of when in Rome test, essentially. They were able to adapt to the new local culture of communication that they found in that group. So I'm going to sort of, finish up here by looking at a little bit sort of how basically your social group, how your social community might shape the way in which you express your communication. So that just leads me on to these last few studies. And again, we're talking sort of really hot off the press kind of data here, but it's one of the things that I find really exciting is that whenever we started to look for variation, we're finding it everywhere. And so features like group size and cohesion shape your communication. And we can see, for example, that something that is, let me see this here, we can see optimality of your gesturing varying between your groups. So if you are in a highly cohesive and small group, such as BOSU, so that bottom group there that you're taking a quick look at, we get clear optimality, and it's actually in the range of optimality we would see in human languages. If we look at Sonso, who are very typical Eastern groups, so they're sort of fission fusion, but kind of, about 60 individuals, they're mid-sized. We see sort of fairly average kind of low-level optimality. And actually, if we look at Waibira, what we would consider a supergroup, they are twice the size of a normal chimpanzee community. They have additional levels of social structure beyond fission fusion. We see counter-optimality, sort of redundancy in their communication. Now, this is really interesting because it's under the kind of circumstances in which we might imagine language emerging, so small cohesive bands of individuals that we're seeing optimality being produced, but it's also under the kind of circumstances where we see investing excess energy, sort of costly signaling, being reflected in the communication of the apes as well. And in human societies, we also see that costly signaling, the extra investment in communication, tends to increase as your group size and structure becomes more sophisticated, becomes more multi-level. And so finally, we're just going to take a very quick look at what happens when you know each other very well. So if we look at, so what we've got here is a social proximity index, how much time you spend with each other. And we talked about this just coming full circle at the beginning when we were talking about the difference between bonobos and chimpanzees and gorillas, how much time do individuals in a group spend together. Here we can see on a case-by-case level that actually your gestural units become shorter the more time you spend communicating with somebody. So it's just backing up this idea that interaction and cohesion is a great way to increase optimality. And it's also something that we would be familiar with so that, when you are talking to someone that you know very well, you can afford to use those kind of shorthand kind of like idioms that you come up with within a small tight-knit group that you might not be able to use if you were communicating with someone who is from a different cultural background to you, a sort of gestural shorthand that's reflected in the apes' gestures. Okay, I'm just going to finish up now just by saying that I think really to get at some of the questions about whether the expression of human language, human social intelligence that we're seeing in language use all around us is unique to humans or just characteristic of humans and also then shared with other species, we have to go beyond the kind of study of species level toolkits and explore the social context of individual interactions that other species are producing when they're communicating with each other. And so I think in order to answer questions of how and why language evolved, we've got to get into ways of how humans and other species are establishing, shaping, and sharing their social identity in their communication. When we do that, then we get to ask some really interesting questions because we can do things now today, like look at intergenerational data sets. So we can look at the impact of ontogeny in life history because we're finally able to amass the kind of multi-decade, multi-generational data sets we need to ask questions of. So not just is there a difference between groups, but what did your, parents' generation look like in the way that they expressed? Or what does your communication do when you change leader and you get a more or less despotic individual in charge of your social politics, for example? We can also ask questions where we compare species that are more genetically similar to each other against those that are more different. And we can contrast that with what happens when you have two species that are genetically more distant from each other, but that are socially more similar to each other. So an East and a West African chimp are genetically more similar than a bonobo, but a West African chimp and a bonobo are socially more similar than an East African chimp. So we can build these kind of big data sets across populations that let us tackle this. We can look, as I was suggesting at the beginning, at how things like cultural traditions and tool use and foraging might shape the way your communication is structured. If we find evidence for that, we get to ask questions about what happens when tool use, that same kind of tool use, is present in another species, another primate, or if we cast our net all the way out to really distant species and individuals. And I think these outgroup comparisons are going to be essential for us, because a lot of the work we've done on comparative communication has been within primates, which is a great way to know how primate communication evolves. But if we see similarities, difficult to disentangle if that's based on our genetic shared heritage as primates with other primates, or if that's based on something to do with our social structure, which we might have more in common with an elephant than we do, for example, with a baboon. And so to answer those kind of questions, my last plea is that we need more data than any one researcher, any one research group's lifetime could produce. So we have to be collaborating across groups to get the kind of diversity and depth of data that we need to answer this level of big question. And at the end of the day, that takes a massive amount of labor. So first of all, I think doing that collaboratively, and it's really heartening to see more and more interspecies, intergroup, into kind of researcher collaborations pulling together these big data sets. But even with all that and the best will in the world, we still have to get the data out of those data sets. So I thought I'd just show you and finish up by showing you how we've been throwing a little artificial intelligence at the problem here. And it's manually locating the behavior that often is one of the most labor-intensive parts of it. One way to tackle it is at least to automate that part. Now, to date, machine learning approaches need really clean data, right? They work incredibly well if you have a single human or a single individual in a white, clean room and a static camera, and that is not how we get other species data. We are running through rainforests and up and down mountains, and the camera's moving, and the environment's moving, and the light's changing, and they're moving. But we're finally at a point where we can actually start to track and follow pose automatically in this kind of video data. And we're hoping this is going to let us open up a whole new world of questions. We've already applied it successfully to train models of things like movements of the mouth so that we could automate data extraction of lip smacking rhythms. And that means that our latest analysis has thousands of frames in it, as opposed to the hundreds that we used to be able to generate manually. We're seeing it adapt really well to different individuals and different divergent visual landscapes. So this was a model trained on those East African chimps you saw at the beginning, and it's transferred really well to this rocky open landscape in wine baffing of Western chimpanzees. And even with new distractions. So that original model didn't have baboons, it wasn't trained on them, but here what you can see is it's recognizing all of those chimps, but it's not recognizing and not trying to follow any of the baboons that are walking through the frame. So I think we have new tools to come at these kind of questions, and I think this is going to allow us, as I said at the beginning, to just open up a lot more of an interesting perspective and perhaps a more level playing field of getting at the heart of what might be going on in other species communication and in human language. So just circling back to that quote from earlier, I think exploring the flexibility in how gesture is used by other apes in the real world in these large data sets is going to help us make a much more profound description of ape communication and a much more interesting comparison to human behavior. And we have to start to incorporate in situ aspects of communication, such as individual expression, affect, emotion, interpersonal context, identity, into our analyses to get there. So in apes, as in humans, we're going to have to get that social context to go beyond the grand cast of characters so that we get to explore the plot. And if you'll indulge me just one final quote, because I love it, because this is how I feel. I've been doing this for 20 years, basically, at this point. And in many ways, I feel like we're just starting. This is the beginning for us. And that's because it took all of that work to work out what was the question we needed to ask and how to do this kind of work in a different kind of way. And I love this Douglas Adams quote because it sums up how I feel, where it's really not where I thought I was going, but I think we're finally got the kind of tools and we finally might be starting from the right place. So I'll just finish up and say thank you very much. And I'd love to, get any feedback and hear your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. That was worth waiting for. I think that was really so in depth around a topic that we actually haven't had on in the discussions before. So I think this is quite interesting for us. We already have some questions popping up in the chat. And I don't know, also we have some people in the line, a couple of people already. It looks like, yeah, we should just jump into it. So Joanne, would you like to start, seeing as you have your hand there raised?
Thank you. Kat, thank you.
Oh, we don't hear you, Joanne.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Thank you so much. This was definitely worth the wait. It was absolutely incredible to hear about your work and everything that's coming out. I have so many questions, but I'll stick to one of them. Whenever you were talking about the perception of responses being slower between different ape species, I was wondering if you have considered the idea of how each species perceives time, and also if different species or different groups have particular understandings about the meaning of silence. Because you see that in human communication, right? There's a classic study in my field about comparing Americans and Finnish dialogue, and how silence is very much understood in perspectives of respect and what it means to respond really fast in regards to the interaction and maintaining relationships. So anyways, just wanted to put those questions out there, but would love to continue the conversation.
Thank you. I love that question. That's such an amazing kind of way to think about it. So I guess yes and no, in that I probably had been thinking along those lines, but not articulating it the way that you just did in terms of a species perception of time. I only really realized when I first started working with gorillas that I'd been thinking about making my work as non-anthropocentric as possible. And I always think about what would the chimps do. I actually started with baboons, but I started mostly with chimps. And it's only when I started working with the mountain gorillas that I realized it wasn't that I'd somehow become this kind of neutral observer of other species communication, but I'd become a chimp-centric person, because when I was filming the interactions, I always, we're filming, there's a gesture, I wait for a response. When a reasonable amount of time has gone by, then I stop filming, because sometimes they do just give up. And guaranteed for the first month, just as I put my camera down and off, then they would respond. And I had basically just shifted my kind of sense of timing in an interaction from being human specific to chimp specific, but it was not appropriate for gorillas. And I do think that there's something about pace of life and kind of that is really playing into this. Like, a gorilla does not need necessarily to communicate very quickly in response. But what I hadn't thought about until you were just talking is that perhaps with some of the steepness of hierarchy, that you might also be getting a sort of indication of taking your time as a sort of respect kind of element of it. I'd love to know more about the human work you were talking about, because I think we could potentially look at that in a really interesting way. Thank you.
No worries. I'll be happy to send you an email and include a lot of my other questions in there, if that's okay.
Thank you. That would be perfect.
Thank you so much.
Nate, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Hi, I'm a longtime fan, first-time caller, and I just wanted to say thank you for that talk. It was just a masterclass, and I so enjoyed it. And I guess my question is related to many of the gestures and aspects of language that you described they seem intended to facilitate social cohesion, facilitate bonding. They're sort of the grease on the wheels of positive interactions, but I look at the news cycle today, and there's global conflict, and the political news in the United States right now, there's just a lot of division. It's very toxic. And so I guess my question, and I don't even want to ask it, but how often do you see gestures being used to sow division or create conflict? I mean, it's sort of a more negative aspect, but I was just wondering is that something you see?
I mean, it's a good question, right? Because, like, is there, I mean, even at a minor level of that, is there, so I've been thinking, for example, about, is there a polite form of making a request? So to sort of what we call a soft imperative, like not like come here, but like, would you come here, please? But you could also potentially have a sarcastic form of kind of like, you know, like some, I love the idea of having, you know, like, I'm trying to work out which ape would be the most sarcastic if there was one now. And I can think of a couple of characters, but one thing that, I guess, to take a positive spin on what you're asking, one thing that I do see the apes doing with their gestures, and something that I find very interesting, is that what we have typically described as threats in other species. So with chimpanzees, they'll describe like stamping a foot or shaking a branch as like a threat. They see it as we describe it as an aggressive act. Now, I think it's the opposite of that. I think this is about the apes setting their boundaries to offset physical aggression or costly aggression to their groups. And I think apes are extremely aware of the costs and benefits of in-group friction. Because I mean, we do see in chimpanzees that when there is mess in the political hierarchy within a group, that they tend suddenly to become more insular. There's less, they're less cohesive, less coherent, and often their territories will shrink a little bit until they've sorted out their internal politics and business, and then they can go back to, you know, basically pushing back on the neighbors. So sometimes the cost of you know, cohesion and social cohesion in your group is that you get actually more intergroup kind of conflict. But so I think there are really interesting ways to explore how other species are using their communication to potentially mitigate and offset communication in ways that might teach us some lessons. I don't know. But whether or not they use it as a way to, so I guess, yeah, you could, it just depends what perspective you would take on that signal. So this is a signal being used in an aggressive way, but doing so prevents a more costly form of aggression. Like, where's the pro and con there? So I'd be curious to try to poke at that a little bit more, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nate. Stephen, would you like to ask your question?
Excellent. Thanks so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I actually had two quick questions, and I'll try and articulate them as well as I can. So one thing that I found really fascinating was your discussion around proximity and the length of gestures in communication. And I was interested to know just generally if there's been much investigation in these subject groups around the concept of interbrain synchrony. I know obviously these are wild populations where it's very hard to capture data like that, but a lot of where my mind goes around that concept is in greater proximity to one another, there's less activation energy to drive these forms of synchrony. And for those less familiar, interbrain synchrony is just basically paired oscillations in brain activity between different individuals. And a lot of what sharing information and communication is all about is getting at that same kind of shared sense of state to accomplish a goal or task or interact in some way. So I was curious first and foremost whether or not there's been any investigation into interbrain synchrony in these sorts of populations. And then the other thing I was curious about is whether there's any investigations going on when you mentioned the intergenerational data as to whether or not there are any context clues historically about what may suggest some of these differences between like Eastern and Western cultures of apes, in that, you know, a lot of these things that we see as these unique differences where there's not a lot, genetically speaking, is kind of these intergenerational sort of cultural developments that emerge. And I'm again speaking from outside of ape populations, since that's not really my background, but a great example from somebody who kind of intersects with this is Sapolsky, who has highlighted things like, you know, wheat farmers versus rice farmers, and how that over generations leads to cultural inheritance of much more like communalist versus individualist behavioral sets. And I didn't know if there are any context clues that have been discovered around that as you're getting into more of these intergenerational studies.
Thank you. So I guess I'll take the easy one first. So we haven't really got data yet on what might be driving intergenerational differences. I do think if we were talking about intergenerational differences within a group, that's still something that we're just at the beginning. beginning of being able to do, because apes live a really long time. And so essentially you need like 40, 50-year data sets, which we're just finally getting from the wild apes to answer those kind of questions. But in terms of east-west differences, I mean, there is a reasonable case to be made, and I think more and more chimp folk on board with the idea that East and West African chimpanzees ought to be different species at this point. West African chimpanzees are behaviorally and physiologically so different from East African chimps, and behaviorally much more proximate to what we might think of as bonobo society. So male-female co-bonded, cohesive, relatively egalitarian. And so those kind of, like, living in that kind of society, and that could have been shaped by, some people have hypotheses about predation effects, creating more kind of cohesive groups and things in West Africa. It's to be determined. But I can imagine that if you live in a systematically more cohesive, more egalitarian society over generations, that is going to lead to differences in how you communicate at a subspecies or population level. I would be fascinated to know whether or not this is, so we're getting those first hints that the West African chimps are more isochronous and more regularly rhythmed in some cases, perhaps therefore potentially more synchronized than their East African counterparts. Now, we're only seeing that in the drumming so far, but we have the timing data to be able to look at it in the gestural exchanges. Excuse me. And I think that might tie in, because nobody is looking at interbrain kind of synchronization in wild apes, but we would need behavioral markers of it. And I think potentially synchronization, synchrony of your movements, of your timing, might be one avenue into that. And so a PhD student that I work with, who is actually now a postdoc because she just kind of passed her viva, but Gal Badihi has done some really lovely work on turn-taking intervals. And we're seeing, as you get in languages, a consistent turn-taking interval, but also then population-wise, minor population-wise variation. It's lovely because it actually overlaps almost perfectly with the turn-taking intervals in language that we're seeing. And so perhaps looking at things like the consistency and predictability of timing and something like turn-taking might be one way perhaps to come at it. Yeah, I would be excited to, we've looked at the groups, but we haven't looked at East-West populations yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Brandon, would you like to ask your question? We don't hear you yet.
Sorry about that.
Oh, yeah.
Kat, that was magnificent. I have two questions, but don't feel obligated to answer both of them. But I'll just throw them each into the air. One is just you know, sometimes when I think about what anthropologists learned when, you know, studying native cultures, let's say in the early 20th century, at the end of several hundred years of, you know, of cultural dislocation as a consequence of genocide, you know, one wonders kind of what would have been, you know, how, you know, whether they underestimated the extent to which what had just transpired over the past several centuries affected what they were seeing. And, you know, you see that in all sorts of accounts where, you know, people like John Muir or whoever were really, you know, sort of blind to that. And so I guess I'm just curious whether you think that things have been lost from great ape societies as a consequence of, you know, the habitat loss and the erosion of their species. And then my other question, you know, I really appreciated what you said early on about how much meaning, how much communication is possible in non-linguistic forms. And I just wonder, you know, whether you think you know, sort of in the popular science discourse and in the scientific discourse, language is overemphasized. And if so, you know, does that matter? Is it something that eventually we'll get to the right idea anyways? Or is that focused on language kind of, you know, warping our view of what animals and ourselves communicate?
Mm-hmm. I love it. Okay, so the first one, it's really hard for me to say definitively yes, but I think so. I'll trying to think about how we might come at this. First of all, one of the things that I sort of see almost as a responsibility that I have at the moment is that the groups and populations of apes I'm working with are in such severe decline. There are groups that we have data from that will not exist in 10 or 20 years. And given the strong and increasingly strong evidence we have for culturally distinct group identities and communication, then sometimes some of the work we're doing, I see this as we call our database sometimes like a data arc. It's essentially our way of trying to preserve something about the culture of an individual group of apes. And I think it's incredibly important that we recognize that, because at the moment in conservation topics and circles, we often talk about species and population numbers, right? We have 10,000, you know, like central chimps, so we have like 40,000 West African chimps. But if you're talking about a decline, like we've just lost 20% of the population, it really matters if that is evenly distributed, or if what you are talking about is the eradication of entire groups while other groups maintain their population level. Because if you remove a few individuals from a group, that is heartbreaking, but the group's cultural identity will in all likelihood perhaps shift, but stay. If you are talking about just removing culture, even if in the future you were able to increase populations and that those populations expanded back into those empty territories, you can't replace the culture. It doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. And so I think recognizing the value in that and the importance of that is one thing that I think we can help to do with this data. And I would be really interested to see to what extent apes living in more anthropogenically impacted habitats had things in common in terms of their communication. And that might be that they have successfully, flexibly shifted their communication to deal with living in an anthropogenic habitat. So some apes that are crop raiding at night because they know that they're safer to do so might have signals that are suited to kind of low light conditions. So it's not necessarily that that it would impoverish your communication or it might reduce it, but I certainly think it's going to shift it in important ways. And if we're asking evolutionary questions, we need to recognize the ways in which we're shifting that with anthropogenic kind of effects. And then on your second question, yes, I'm really lucky in many ways. I grew up speaking and being exposed to a lot of different languages, and I've lived in places where I had no language in common with communities that I was working with. And so I don't think it's entirely by coincidence, although I didn't really think about this until many years later, that I am a very gestury person, but also very interested in the non-linguistic ways in which we communicate with each other. And I think language is fascinating, but I think what we focus on is not the interesting parts of it. And I think we're so focused on syntax and syntactic combinations. We're so focused on structure that we are not interested in the kind of things that you could have a much more simple language or a very much more restricted set of sounds and meanings and do something much more interesting with them. Like I'm fascinated by song, storytelling, how we communicate with each other. And I know that I've been able to kind of do elements of that without having language in common. So I think for me, sometimes it's just a bit of a distraction because it is, in some ways, it comes so easily to us that we underestimate it, right? I think that's part of the problem, that we language is just something that we acquire so instinctively, so quickly that it's almost like we don't see the wood for the trees, I guess. We're just surrounded by it the whole time. And so if we can step out of it in whatever way we can and think about, one of the things I love with the interspecies internet conversations is like, cephalopods, right? Like I can think about what another primate species might be communicating about, but octopi, like where do you even start when you can think with your tentacles, right? And so, yeah, I think the more we can do to step up out of just the way in which we express language and think about what we're doing with it will get us to some more interesting questions across other species.
Right on. Thank you.
Go ahead, Treasure. Thanks, Brandon.
Great. Thank you very much for the discussion. I appreciate it. I just had a few quick questions. First is a general question. Do apes give each other names or individual sounds, i.e. the drumming? So how do they recognize each other as an individual by name? Like, will a mother name a child, for instance?
I mean, wild apes, we don't have evidence for that. So when in the drumming, I have my drum, and that is going to be individually recognized. What we haven't seen any evidence for is if I wanted to call your name, me using your drum to get you. So you see what I mean? That kind of way. And there's a little bit of evidence for something akin to that in, for example, dolphins and some of the cetaceans with the whistles, where the signature whistles that I produce as an individual, another individual might be calling my attention by using my signature whistle. But we haven't seen anything like that in the apes. Part of the reason potentially for that is that frequently they don't necessarily need to. So most gesture use is already in a one-on-one in like close conversational situation, and the ways in which we might use names and drawing attention to names would be perhaps either in a large group situation or across a distance. And so the ways in which I might easily recognize name use in another species, we don't really have the opportunity, or we haven't yet. But it would be interesting to think about ways in which we might be able to come at that. I think I just don't have the tools to ask the question yet in their communication, maybe.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The second is about learned behavior. Is there evidence of the 1,000th monkey or ape phenomenon where one learns a new skill and others will spontaneously use the technique without any direct teaching, i.e. washing fruit in water before eating?
Yes, and I think we do see really lovely evidence for that. So the example that springs to mind, just because it was one that well, two, I guess I can give you one, is that, well, we have inferred that that was the case on the basis of these group differences that we call cultures. So the idea that this group does things over here with the same environment and the same genetic pool as and they do it the same way as each other, and this group over here in the same environment would solve the same problem using a different technique, right? And those kind of stable differences we've called cultures. But to really see like learning, we had one lovely example in Bodongo where by entire coincidence, I was there on the day that a female chimpanzee innovated basically like scraping moss, putting it together and using it to sponge water with. Now the chimps, this wasn't her like reinventing like the iPhone or something, because the chimps do use sponges made of other materials. This was the first time in a common behavior we see all the time that somebody used a new material. And because I was just there filming with the group, I could actually track all the times anybody saw anybody do anything and when and where that emerged in the other individuals in the group over the next days. And what we basically showed is that if you saw someone else doing it, you did it. And if you didn't, you didn't. With one exception, which was that there was one female chimp who came, picked up a sponge, used a sponge, and then made a moss sponge and went ahead with it, but she hadn't seen anybody else doing it. So we were like, ah, shoot, okay, there goes the study. But when we looked in detail at the video, the sponge she picked up was a moss sponge. So learning both by watching other individuals, but also by interacting with the products that they've made is something that I think we have nice evidence for now. And we've seen, for example, now in Waibira, there was a female that migrated in who would dig wells. So she would dig in the muddy kind of water area in the kind of gravel and wait for clean water to come up. And for a year or two, these, big adult male chimps who would normally not be necessarily very polite about sharing would come over and just like watch her and wait. When she'd gone, they'd drink, but they wouldn't. And it's taken years, but now slowly it was, first of all, the kids learned, and then it went horizontally, and now basically more and more individuals have acquired it. But it's not active teaching in the way we think about teaching, but it's what we would call more of a master apprenticeship. And I actually think that, in human cultures, we get good examples of that. So the classic one we use is things like Japanese culture, where often the way of learning a really skilled task is that you just watch a master doing it, and they are not going to change their behavior or shape their behavior. They're just going to accept you being allowed to watch them do it. And we definitely have other evidence for that kind of facilitation of learning experience.
Great, thank you. And my last quick question is just about, is the ape brain formed like a human brain with a right hemisphere using creativity and a left that uses logic?
I can tell you that they have hemispheric specialization. So we see from a little bit, I mean, it's obviously rare that we have this kind of data for other apes, but people like Bill Hopkins have been doing fMRI studies, which in some cases literally means when the gorilla from the local zoo is going through his health check, he gets knocked out, brought to the local hospital and put through their fMRI machine. So it's not the kind of thing we can do every day, but they were seeing hemispheric specialization for communication. Whether or not that's creative or logic, I think would be beyond what we've been able to look at so far. But one of the things that I'm most excited by is that ape brains are by and large shaped essentially the same as ours are. But there has been, long-standing evidence that there are differences in terms of the amount of connectivity, in terms of the amount of white matter kind of ratios. What I'm really excited about is that we're finally, there's a study going on right now that is taking brains from apes who died naturally in the wild, and then basically getting them straight into liquid nitrogen and back and scanning them at high resolution. What we're seeing is those ape brains from wild individuals are extremely well connected, extremely well developed, and that perhaps some of what we have seen as a chimpanzee-human brain difference is actually less about the species and more about the environment the individual grew up in. And we see that in human children too. So if you grow up in a socially impoverished environment, that impacts your language use, that impacts your social, but it also impacts your brain at a structural level. So I think some of what we've been thinking might be a species difference, might actually be that we've essentially been comparing humans in our incredible richness to a very small set of apes who lived in a very socially and physically impoverished environment, which even under the best captive circumstances where the apes are very well cared for, it can't reflect what they would get in the wild, unfortunately.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kat, while you've just discussed this example where you were filming apes and you kind of got this experience, I want to just quickly go to the question that Eleanor has posed in the chat. I don't know, Eleanor, if you'd like to ask it yourself. I don't know if you have the ability to open your mic. I can also pose it, so I will just read it out. The question is, have you found that communication is somehow different when they know humans are watching?
How would we tell, right? Apes are very aware of our attention and interest. It's one of the first things that you learn to do if you want to work with them, and you want to get data on them. I'm an observation-only scientist, I'm a field scientist, but I am under no illusions that I have no impact on the apes that I study just by being there. Because I think sometimes observational people like to claim that, right? We're just there watching, we don't have an influence. We do. Where we stand, who we stand next to, who we pay attention to. And especially chimps in particular have this sort of sleep with one eye open approach to life, which I think reflects their society, even when they're very well habituated. These are individuals that their parents were habituated, and I've known them since they were born, and they still just keep an eye on you. So I think it's difficult to know. I think we do have an increasing amount of camera trap data, and that's a really powerful new tool for us to be able to ask questions like that. And there are ape species that I think are less sensitive to our attention. So one of the things that I loved about working with the mountain gorillas was just how little they cared about me being there. And I hadn't noticed it was as much a thing until I started moving from being a chimp person to working with them, and that they will just be sprawled on their backs, snoring fast asleep. Moms will literally just like dump their infant somewhere near your feet while they go climb a tree and feed. I sometimes get the impression of being used as a creche. Here's the entertainment, kids, kind of thing. So I think undoubtedly we're influencing their behavior. Whether that is shaping and changing the nature and expression of their gestures, are they more discreet, are they quieter? I don't know, but I think eventually with the camera trap data we're getting, we might be able to ask those kind of questions, just not yet.
Great. So we have another hand up. I'm sorry, I don't have your full names, but let's go with the next question.
Oh, that may be me.
That's you.
About that. I quite see this my own screen. Yeah, I'm Cindy Willett, and yeah, I was really interested in the question you had. The comment you made in passing about sarcastic apes. Could you say a little bit more about that? Like, do they use irony in their gesture? How they might use irony? Is it a teenage thing? I don't know. Anything more about how it might fit into their social, their communication? More aggressive apes use it, or it's more passive aggressive? How, anything more about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing I would love to know more about. So there are examples of apes who, one of the questions that I've thought about before in the past is like, do apes have a sense of humor? Do they tell jokes? How would we know if they were? There are things that I see in the forest that are just objectively funny. Like there's, like the young big guy who is showing off and displaying, and he gets his foot tangled in a climber and face plants. And I am like, you can see on the camera, like I'm sort of chortling silently to myself because it's impossible to suppress. And yet I've looked around, as he does often, they kind of like pop up and like, did anyone see? And the other apes are just like poker face. And I'm like, do they just not enjoy physical humor? Like this was kind of objectively entertaining. Or is it that they found it funny and they didn't want to show, or they found it funny and they express that in a different kind of way? We know they laugh, they have a laughter signal, but that's typically more to do with play than it is anything that we might think of as a sort of socially strategic kind of use of humor. I suppose what I was thinking about a little bit when I was thinking about individuals that I might consider being, almost sarcastic or something, is there are chimps I know that have sort of the way in which they express themselves, in which they communicate, and this is me, like this is wildly speculative, because this is certainly not something that we've been able to find a way to get at so far, but like younger males who kind of have been on the rise up through the social ranks and who will be, I almost kind of like dismissive, kind of short, kind of like with somebody, or like I will greet you, but like in a kind of like I don't really mean it kind of way. So I've seen apes who, if they have a fight with each other, after they have a fight, when they're reconciling, it's lovely because they will literally shake hands with each other. But I've seen like a male chimp who basically had to say sorry because the other guy was a high ranking guy. So he comes up, he's going to shake hands, and he literally looks the other way and gives this like little feeble kind of like handshake when the other guy has extended his hand. And it was the most teenage, like make up and say sorry boys, and they kind of, fine, we'll just shake hands and go. So I can think of examples that seem to reflect that, but to what extent that's me reading myself into it and how we might get at it, I'm excited to try, because the apes have a sense of humor thing, especially when you look at captive apes and some of the enculturated ape work that suggests that they do. And maybe we're seeing it in them because they were raised in a cultural environment where the markers of humor are the kind of things that we recognize because they were raised in a human humor-centric environment. So I think the capacity to have a sense of humor is there, but I just don't know how they express it, and it drives me a little crazy sometimes.
Great. We actually have two questions in the chat, which I might just quickly put into one, which is about the interspecies potential of the gesturing system. So we have Eric and also Ronnie who kind of posed the question whether you've tried to communicate with apes based on their own gestural signals or their body language.
So one thing that I didn't mention is that these gestures do seem to be ape typical by and large. So when we're talking about repertoires of 140, 150 units at this point, most of them are shared. So it's an ape-wide repertoire. You do get some species typical ones, and interestingly, the more closely related a species, the more overlap there is. So we were seeing kind of chimpanzees and bonobos were at, basically almost 100% overlap, a little bit more species typical gesture use in gorillas, and again in the orangs, although we have very little data there yet. And we certainly now have evidence that young children, who, just as language is coming online, 1, 2, 3-year-olds, are using a remarkably large number of the ape gestures when they're communicating with each other. So we thought we'd find a few when we started looking at these young kids. Like, like some of them are just familiar, like shoo, go away is an ape gesture that we also, use in the same kind of way. But we were finding, 50, 52 different gestures from the ape repertoire being used by these young kids. So lots of potential for interspecies communication. Early hints are that some of the meanings, at least between chimps and bonobos, seem to overlap at that kind of large, timeless meaning kind of level. The occasion use, the sort of nuance of it does seem to be different. But we've got a lot more work to do there. I haven't tried to communicate with any of the wild apes that I work with, and that's for two reasons, I suppose. One is that I'm not there to try to communicate with them. I would worry about the impact that would have on our relationship, or their trust of me, if I kind of get in their business, basically. And also, I don't think I do a very good job of it yet. Like I feel pretty confident and comfortable, but still, like, I guess I've been in enough linguistic cultures where a small shift in tone changes the thing you're saying from please may I order the chicken to an insult to somebody's mother, right? Like there are major consequences for getting this a little bit wrong, especially if there are elements of expression we're not sensitive to. So I speak a lot of languages, but none of them are tonal. And so my ability to detect tonal differences in those languages like Thai or Vietnamese is very limited. So I think too much potential to go wrong. And the only place that I have ever done it, and I didn't realize how much it would kind of like touch me as a pleasure, is in a couple of the captive situations. So there are apes in Inuyama in Japan who were human raised. And to be able to walk into the lab in the morning when they come in from, there's a testing room and they can choose when they come in and out. But to be able to greet them, and my instinct when I greeted chimpanzee, for example, was to greet her as a chimp, and I could, and she greeted me back as a chimp, and it was that moment of like connection of like you knew what I meant when I did that, and I knew how to respond to that. That was really lovely, and I absolutely think that there'd be the opportunity to do that. I just think we have to be really careful about when and where and how we might in the future.
Wow, what a humble answer, Kat. I think that's just incredible that you can even be in a position to do that. And I think that makes your research so very authentic. Ronnie, would you like to ask or follow up on that question?
Yeah, I was one of the two people that asked
it. Great.
I'm a veterinarian, and although I haven't personally worked with primates, a veterinarian's constant challenge is how to communicate with the various species with whom we work. And I could see that your work would be incredibly valuable to zookeepers and veterinarians who care for primates, because if you can somehow reassure them or explain what you're doing, it's going to be fabulous. So I would love to see whatever you learn shared with the veterinary community.
Thank you. I just want to give a very quick shout out in response to that to Gal Badihi, who actually she comes from a primate welfare background. She did her PhD and now her postdoc on ape gesture. And one of the projects she is looking to set up right now is essentially exactly that. And it's not necessarily that we were already thinking about communicating with the apes, but we think that the ability to recognize what they're communicating with each other, to see small indications of shifts, like if you are going in as a wildlife veterinarian and you need to know and understand what the rank differences are, or your ability to detect the welfare and well-being of the apes, like we hope that these are going to be gesture tools, and she's basically working on finding ways to make those accessible to the captive sanctuary veterinarian community right now. So hopefully stay tuned, but yeah, we're really excited about the potential for that. Thank you.
Can you spell her name for me?
I will type it in the chat. So if I put it in the chat, if I can do everyone, there we go.
Thank you.
That's great to know. I mean, I think that in general is the aim of what we do here, is to try to understand how we can use this to benefit animals and build the compassion and the connectivity with the animal kingdom and the natural world around us. I think that's a really great position to leave it on today, Kat. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I think it's great for us as a community to get back to primates, because this is a really, I think, familiar space for some of us who don't necessarily work all the time with animals. So I think this is really fantastic. If anybody else has any questions, you're also more than welcome to jump on our Slack. So we have a Slack channel where we discuss, and you can add any upcoming projects or anything that you'd like to share with the community. I'll pop that in the chat as we head off. And we will have our next lecture happening next month. So keep an eye on your inboxes for the next speaker. And we really thank you very, very much again for joining us after this small little technical hiccup. But I think this has been such a fascinating presentation, and We will put, of course, the recording on YouTube so everybody has access to that. And of course, if you do want the chat, we can provide that for you as well. Just get in touch. So thank you very much from all of us. And thank you, Kat. Thank you for your time. And thank you for sharing this amazing work with us. And thank you all for your wonderful questions and your attendance. Have a great weekend.